Please get started.
All righty, so I think I can take it over from here. So I'm just going to share my slide and sorry guys, I've got to move some stuff around so I can actually get this to presentation mode. Thank you for patience. All right, so as Catherine was saying, today we are going to talk about FAT versus ACT, and more importantly, how to weigh your options. So welcome everyone and happy Monday. And thank you to the BCC counseling team for giving us this opportunity to hold this session. And for those of you who are able to join live, thank you so much for joining in. And for those of you who will watch this later, thank you for taking the time to learn about this stuff. Now, just to introduce myself, I am from C2 Education. My name is Maylene Kara-George. I have 15 years of experience in the K-12 tutoring and college admission space, and I was doing some fun estimation recently, and I think I have about well over 20,000 tutoring and counseling hours under my belt. I also graduated from Thomas Jefferson High School for Science and Technology in Fairfax County and Dartmouth College for my undergraduate. So I just call those out just because I know, I'm very familiar with competitive academic environments and admission spaces, and I know Montgomery County can count itself as one of those, for better or for worse. Now, today we are going to walk you through how to help your students decide, and if you are the students, how to help yourself decide which standardized test to take, and discuss why that is still an important part of college admissions. If you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat throughout the workshop. And what we'll do is have a co-pilot, Jackie, in the room, or I think she should be in the room, and she'll select some of the most popular ones and try to prioritize and address those. And we'll also give you information on how to, if you have follow-up questions, how we can take the time to answer them at the end of this workshop. And so, Jackie, also do me a favor and actually Teams me if you can, because I can't see the chat right through Zoom. So I'll use my phone to check Teams if there are issues like people can't hear me or the slides are looking weird, things of that nature. So on Teams, okay, Jackie, hopefully you heard that. All right, so in terms of our agenda, first, we'll review the role of testing in the current landscape of college admissions. Then we'll spend some time on the highlights of both the SAT and ACT. Now, I was checking out the summer college workshop programming at BCC, and your counselors have done an incredible job curating some robust programming this summer. So I know there are already individual sessions on each of these tests. I can't remember if they already happen or are coming up. So if you've attended those, great, this will be a review. But later, we'll also take some time to compare the two tests and give some guidance on what to consider in order to decide which test is right for you or your students. So this should still put a unique little twist to that, and it's always good to review, right, the differences between these tests. After I go through all of, the first several bullet points of the agenda, I'll take the time to pass on the baton to Nancy, who is the program director at C2 Education Bethesda, so that she can wrap up our, our workshop, and we'll address questions then. So the first item that we'll talk about again is the role of college admissions testing. So every college, as we know, has its own standardized testing policy, and they run the gamut, right? That's the spectrum from most restrictive to least restrictive. Well, actually, the way we have it on the slide, least restrictive to most restrictive. And so, sort of, I just realized that it was out of order. But these policies include test optional, test blind, test flexible, and test required. So test optional schools will consider standardized tests if submitted. However, we do see evidence that submitting scores can boost chances of admission, and I'll call out maybe at least one statistic on that. Test blind schools do not consider standardized tests, and schools that have this policy include some big names like Caltech and the UC system. For these schools, however, the applicant's GPA, course rigor, and essays will be key to making admissions decisions. They're already key, but they'll take a more prominent role when there is no standardized test to take into account. Now, and then there are some schools like NYU that can be categorized best as maybe test flexible, meaning if the students choose to submit test scores, they can choose from a wider set of options than just the standard SAT and ACT. Then, of course, there are test required schools, which require either the SAT or ACT. And often there are guidelines of how recent the test scores must be. So, for example, the most common guideline is probably within the past 5 years. So, because 5 years is quite generous, a vast majority of students have scores that still fit those guidelines without really having to worry too much about them. So why do we need to be intentional in deciding which standardized test to pursue? Well, because more colleges are actually returning to test required policies. Schools that have announced this change back to test required include a mix of top tier IB schools as well as state schools. You can see a selection of them on this slide. Stanford also last month just reinstated testing for the 2025-2026 application cycle. And that's particularly relevant in case there are younger students today or parents of younger students. And those watching the recording, just keep that in mind, that Stanford has joined the ranks. Now, why are test policies evolving? As we know, the big wave of loosening test requirements recently were almost exclusively due to COVID, right? Testing centers were fully closed, hence access was non-existent. Today, those barriers no longer exist. So colleges have had an opportunity to reevaluate their policies and have even conducted research to determine whether testing is an essential part of college admissions. Now, test optional and flexible policies remain in place because it was hypothesized that they were more equitable, but some research has shown that that isn't necessarily the case. So in terms of the research, research has shown that a couple of things, but mainly that the test scores, when integrated in the admissions process with GPA and other essential components, are a crucial indicator of college performance and a more predictive indicator than just GPA, course rigor, and those other things alone without the test scores. We also at C2 know that the skills that we teach our students to prepare for their admissions tests cultivate various academic skills, including executive ones like long-term planning, prioritizing, time management, along with more concrete, like less abstract skills that are essential, like grammar rules, math skills, and essential college level reading comprehension skills that will ensure student success in college. So we're not just concerned about making sure they can get to college, but that they'll thrive once they're in college. These tests also provide a more objective standard than GPA to review all students during the admission cycle, because then there are no issues with grade inflation, or it can control for such issues. Testing data also gives colleges insight into potential services needed at their school, include, like, for example, more robust writing support. So I mentioned research on equity, right? MIT and Dartmouth, among others, I'm sure, have done their research when to inform their decision to reinstate testing requirements. And what they found was that test scores were integral also to their being able to identify high achieving students from underrepresented groups, including first generation students. So it's not surprising to me that a lot of elite colleges are hopping on this trend of reinstating testing, since creating a diverse class is an important institutional goal at these schools. So all students should plan to take the SAT or ACT. Given the trend we discussed, it's important for students to recognize that these testing policy changes happen quickly and often happen in the spring or summer for the upcoming application cycle. Stanford gave a little bit of an extra heads up, right? But it's still, I'm sure a lot of students are still scrambling, right? So if a student waits until those changes are announced, they will have limited options. Additionally, we consistently see that students who submit test scores are admitted at higher percent than those that don't. For example, at the University of Virginia for the class of 2026, the admission rate for students that had test scores included was 23.8%, whereas the admission rate for those without test scores included was closer to 11.6%. So that's a massive difference, almost double. So testing is important when it comes to that. Testing may also open up a student to financial aid and scholarship opportunities. I know there are certain institutions that are technically test optional for admission, but once you get in, they can still require test scores for honors programs or scholarship, internal scholarship considerations. So we don't want to put our students or ourselves in a position where we're closing up opportunities accidentally by not having a test score at the ready. Having a test score and not ultimately using it is a much better position to me than not having one and having to scramble. Also keep in mind that there is no preference given for the SAT versus ACT in college admission, so students should choose the test that is best for them. And also keep in mind that you can always make these decisions of whether to include the test score or not on a school per school basis, right? Okay, now let's, to help us understand which test is best, let's first understand each test, so starting with the SAT. So what is the SAT? So since March of this year, the SAT is an adaptive computer-based college entrance exam administered by the College Board and offered about 7 times a year. The portion that's since March is just the fact that it's adaptive, right? Everything else has been true for a while. The SAT is designed to measure a high school student's readiness for college and provide a common data point for student comparison during the admission cycle. I also want to call out here the October test, which is going to be the last test that can be included in the applications of those seniors applying for most early applications. So take note of that. Now let's talk overall text structure and scoring for the SAT. The SAT is a little over 2 hours long, divided into 2 main modules, verbal and math. As I mentioned, it is also adaptive. So what does that mean? For each section, students will be given 2 modules, a baseline module and an adaptive module. Performance in the baseline module determines the difficulty of the second module of questions. This impacts scoring quite a bit because questions are weighted. So in order to get the maximum question score, you must score into the higher adaptive module, or your points potential will essentially cap out at around 600 to 650. And that's a game changer for a lot of these elite schools, right? You can also see that the scores range from 200 to 800 per subject, which add up to about 400 to 1600 for the composite scores. Colleges also generally allow super scoring of the SAT, which just means they'll take the test, the student can take the test at least twice, and then you can put together your best verbal score and the best math section scores together. Just keep in mind, though, that super scoring policies differ by school. So make sure you check the policy of each school on your list. And do not just treat it with a blanket policy, because that's certainly not true. So looking specifically at the SAT and reading and writing section, and sometimes when I'm being a little lazy, I'll call it verbal, right? Because reading and writing make up the verbal section. So just FYI, they are interchangeable. So the reading and writing section is, like I said, broken down into 2 separate modules of 27 questions in 32 minutes per module. Also, at the bottom here, we see the call out for 64 minutes. Just keep in mind that the 64 minutes means it's referring to the entire verbal section. It's 32 minutes per module. Also remember that test takers do not get a break between these 2 verbal modules. And so then you need to mentally prepare to work continuously, even though technically there are 2 separate modules. One is to determine, it's adaptive to determine which harder or easier module you'll get into in the next section. So in terms of the pros of the SAT reading and writing, specifically as compared to the ACT, they are, so first of all, there are fewer questions per topic, and topic meaning reading and writing and math. And there's no long reading passages, and that can be beneficial for some students. You can see at the bottom of the slide that the time per question, around 71 seconds, is also fairly long, especially relative to the ACT, as I will show later. SAT math, as with reading and writing, is also broken into 2 modules that are tested continuously. Each module is 35 minutes long for a total of 70 minutes. And also note that unlike the ACT, a good chunk of questions on SAT math require that students generate their own responses, typing in the answers versus just selecting a multiple choice. So that's a major difference between the 2 tests for now. Those were highlights for the SAT. Now let's do the same with the ACT, and hopefully you can start seeing how they're similar and different. So unlike the SAT, the ACT is still a pen and pencil, not pen, sorry, paper and pencil, excuse me, Monday, right? Pencil and paper college entrance exam. And it's also administered by a different company, unlike what some people think. It's administered by ACT Inc. out of Iowa. The ACT designed its test to measure a high school student's readiness for college as well, and to also provide a common data point for student comparison during admissions. Also, like the SAT, it is offered about 7 times per year. Do note, though, that if you look at the bottom row of the graphic of the table, for seniors applying early, the October ACT, unlike the SAT, is quite a bit later. October SAT is early October, October ACT is late October. So that will probably be too late for most early deadlines. But again, check your specific school deadlines, because most early decision deadlines are November 1, but there are, some schools have multiple rounds of early decision or early application rounds. So just double check that. But know that the ACT takes about 10 to up to 24 days to score. So that's something to keep in mind, which is why I don't think the October test will be sufficient for students applying early. And unlike the SAT, the ACT is significantly longer at almost 3 hours long. Plus, there's actually an optional 40-minute essay that students in this region don't normally opt to take, but just know that that exists. It is also different in that it's broken down into 4 distinct subject modules: English, which tests grammar and convention and things of that nature, math, reading, which tests reading comprehension, obviously, and science. If you look at the score report, you can see that the composite score for the ACT is found by averaging all subject scores and then rounding up if relevant. So in this example, it's rounded down because not relevant there, rounding rules. But because the composite comprises 4 sections instead of just the 2 subjects for like in the SAT, moving an average composite ACT score can be difficult. Now, I don't know if you can, I just want to call out the little text under our title here in red. Hot off the presses are actually changes that the ACT just announced last week. So we can't say much for sure, but the short story is that the ACT will shorten its test significantly to be comparable in length as the SAT. However, the most important part for everyone in this room is, or in this virtual room rather, is that the changes will not take effect until spring 2025 at the earliest. So that's why for the rest of this webinar, we're still talking about the current form of the ACT. But again, if you happen to be younger or have younger siblings, just keep this in mind. It will obviously change the decision-making process for those trying to select between the 2 once the changes take effect. But you can just ignore that for now because it's irrelevant for the next 9-10 months. Now, I've already mentioned that the ACT English section tests things like grammar, convention, and tone. I just want to call out here the time per question. So it's 36 seconds per question. And I don't, not that we're in the business of memorizing all the times per question, but this is about half of a typical SAT verbal question. So this is what we mean by the ACT moves a lot faster. The ACT math does allow a calculator, and you can see here that the average time per question is almost double that of an English question. So that sounds good, right? You're like, oh, I get a little time, more time actually on the ACT. However, this is still lower than SAT's time per question in math. For the SAT, again, it was about 1.5 minutes, so it's still quite a bit shorter. ACT reading has 5 long passages, one of which will be a dual passage so that you can compare and contrast the two texts. It also has minimal graphics and will test students on sequence of events, cause and effect, and comparison of various events, facts, even like tone of the passages, etc. The time per question is not as short as the English section, right? It's 53 seconds per question. But again, this is still shorter overall than SAT verbal of like 71 something seconds per question. The ACT Science has the same breakdown in terms of time and number of questions as the ACT reading, but the content is obviously going to be science heavy. Comfort with data and graphical representations will be super important. Now, technically, I've been teaching the ACT for a long time. A student does not need extensive advanced like AP level science knowledge to do well on this section. However, basic high school level science facts will be important, especially to not make silly mistakes and to score in the 30s. So like I've seen questions that require knowledge of covalent bonds, alloys, components for photosynthesis, things of that nature. So if you're good or your students are pretty good about memorizing those facts because they needed them to get a good grade in their science classes, they're fine. But for students that are where science is not like riveting to them and those knowledge tend to kind of leak out of their brains after they're done with the class, that could be not a deal breaker. But again, if you are trying to score in the 30s, it could be a deal breaker because with 40 questions, there's a much smaller buffer, right? Of before the scores start going down dramatically. Now that we've discussed the two tests, let's compare them. So this slide has a lot of content, which I don't even like on a PowerPoint. But I just want to be able to highlight them, put everything that we've talked about or shown side by side. So I will call out some important differences though. So number one, the SAT, again, is adaptive and computer-based, while the ACT is not adaptive and is largely offered on paper, with select locations offering some computer-based testing, but that's not, even with the changes that they announced, they did not hint that they were trying to make it largely digital. So those are going to continue to be like a big difference between the two, the format. And then next, the next biggest difference is total score, right? How they're scored is different. The SAT will be a sum of the 2 section scores for SAT reading, writing versus math, whereas the ACT will take, the composite score will take an average of the 4 section scores on the ACT. The pacing also, as you probably gathered, is very different, with the SAT providing substantially more time per question while also being an overall shorter test. So on the next slide, we'll dive a little more into some broader differences between the two tests and what they might mean for students trying to decide on which test to take. So first difference is design philosophy. So the College Board describes the SAT as being aligned with what a student needs for college and career readiness. So as we've discussed, this means that the SAT often draws on college level reading and content comparable to APs for its content in keeping with this goal. The ACT, on the other hand, focuses on what is taught to a student in school at a standard level. So the result is often questions that can feel more straightforward and easier to tackle for some students. These differing philosophies don't necessarily impact a single concept area or section, but rather may relate to a student's overall academic strength or areas of opportunity. So I like to think of the SAT as more prospective, like forward-looking, right? In their test design versus the ACT is more retrospective, more like, okay, what have you learned so far from ninth grade up to this point in time? Now, being a higher achieving student is not a guarantee that the straightforward questions on the ACT will be easier for you, and students taking these tests shouldn't assume that either. Next difference is scoring and superscoring. So while neither test penalizes you for an incorrect answer, so you should never leave anything blank, how sections are scored will differ one test to another. As highlighted previously, the SAT is the sum of 2 sections and the ACT is the average of the 4 sections. If students score consistently across all 4 areas of the ACT, they can move their score fairly linearly. However, for students that have a score that is a substantial outlier from the others, for example, if students just like have, a substantially lower science score compared to everything else, it will take a lot of work to pull that individual score up. And also to therefore move the composite score up. And then the last difference are the question types, right? To summarize, the SAT uses short reading passages, I think up to 100 to 150 words each, that focuses on an individual question. So one question per little passage. The length of the SAT also means that there are only a few questions per concept area, and this can be beneficial in that weaknesses may hurt students less, but it can also be detrimental if you're counting on certain skills to prop you up. Another difference is that the ACT has a dedicated English and science section. With English, students need to count on many more writing-based, meaning like grammar-based, syntax, convention-based questions, and that can have a positive or negative factor for the student, depending on their personal comfort with those topics, with grammar, syntax, convention, etc. The science section does not necessarily support students with a science interest, but it does mean students need to be more prepared for additional long reading passages and also really wonky looking graphics and interesting, seemingly complicated experiments. It's very important for students to know how to remain calm and see the forest instead of the trees when dealing with the science section. The other biggest difference will be the inclusion of student-generated math questions. There are fewer ways to strategize on these questions when the answer isn't known, right? Because you can't use the with multiple choice, we teach students to eliminate strategically, and there's a variety of ways to do this. And then when you can, the more answer choices you can eliminate, the more statistically you've increased the chance of getting the right answer. Whereas like the choices are almost limitless. I can't remember how many digits the generated responses will be allowed on the digital SAT, but the more digits allowed, the more the combination of possibilities can be, right? So you can't do random or even strategic guessing on the student generated responses on the SAT, whereas the ACT is just all multiple choice. So generally speaking, does this mean that the ACT is easier than the SAT, especially since I mentioned, the questions tend to be more straightforward, simple, it's about looking backwards at everything that a typical high school student has learned instead of heavier on AP style or AP level complex reading. The short answer is no. This is actually, I think, a common misconception for students and families. But the ACT isn't easier, even if some of the questions are more straightforward. It's just different. Students across all achievement levels can struggle, especially if they can't go fast. However, there are some signs that may mean that it's worth trying the ACT, and that's at the bottom half of the slide. So if you or your student prefer generally a paper test, I know I personally do prefer that. If you work quickly and accurately, if you don't have a history of making silly mistakes when you work quickly and accurate, well, that's implied with accurately, but when you work quickly, you don't make silly mistakes. And if you don't overthink when encountering more literal and straightforward questions. And if you aren't intimidated by a longer test or you don't mentally zone out when the test is almost 3 hours long, the ACT may work well for you. And remember that timing might be irrelevant in the next year or so, but it's still very, very relevant today. So now let's talk about how to determine which test best fits you or your student. So in terms of determining best fit, we strongly recommend that you take you or the student take a full length practice test of each test. So one full length practice SAT, and then separately one full length practice ACT. The full length part is important. Partial tests will not provide the full ACT experience or the full adaptive nature of the SAT. I would even argue taking them in chunks, like divided over different days. Also you're missing something important in terms of determining which test works best, unless obviously some folks have accommodations, and part of those accommodations does include taking the sections in different days. Okay, I'm obviously not talking to those folks, right? But if you have no accommodations and you have to take it all in one sitting in the real thing, you should take it under testing condition for the practice test. I would even go as far as say, take them on 2 separate days, because if you take it all in one fell swoop, that's like, 5+ hours of testing. Your brain might be jello by the time you take the second test, and you will artificially disadvantage that test, right? I would take them 2 separate days. I would take them both in the mornings, because the tests generally are in the mornings, and take it in a quiet place, sit up, don't take it in bed, snuggling up under the covers, right? Like just basically mimic the real thing as much as possible, because that's how we can really, basic science, right? Like basic experimental design, right? All else being equal, controlling for constants, how do these tests pan out for you? So we at C2, I know, administer these practice tests as well. And in fact, our practice SAT is also digital and adaptive, like the real thing. We actually use the same background software that College Board uses. After you get your scores, after you take these full practice tests separate days, right? The scores can then be directly compared between SAT to ACT to determine best fit. There's a ton of concordance tables for this. Now, as we touched on, certain things can make the ACT harder for some students. So some students do struggle with the pace, and then they end up running out of time. Some students also really struggle with long reading passages. That's just a few of those, the things that make ACT harder. I would also say, while both SAT and ACT allow the calculator, I mentioned in the chat for the folks that were able to log on a few minutes before the start of this webinar, but I mentioned that I believe Desmos is a game changer for the digital SAT. So on the ACT, you're not allowed to bring a physical laptop, right? So you are only allowed to use certain approved graphing calculators and not your phone, right? So because of that, students have to use their TIs, basically. On the SAT, you can still use the TIs, but when we work at C2, we actually strongly discourage students to do that unless it's necessary, because Desmos can handle all of that and more. It's much more powerful. That's kind of outside of the scope of this webinar, but I just want to call that out. Students will know what I'm talking about, right? Like the powers of Desmos, like implicit equations, ability to quickly generate tables, so on and so forth. So just students keep that in the back of your mind, that the ACT can be a little harder just because the TIs aren't as intuitive as Desmos. But the only way you can confirm is by taking full-length practice tests and see how that goes. So I talked about how the ACT might be harder for some students, right? Now, similarly, certain weaknesses on the SAT or difficulties with computer-based adaptive tests can be detrimental for students that are sensitive to that, right? So it is really, really important that we take the time to determine that. Now, there is no reason for students to take official SAT or ACTs just to determine the best fit. I think it wastes the score, it wastes the fees, right? Not that, you can take several scores. But several official tests, but I wouldn't recommend signing up for an official test just to get a baseline. So take practice tests instead of official tests, and then use the feedback. And, as long as you try to mimic testing conditions as much as possible and take a full test, you can, that's enough information for you to be able to choose the best test and focus on that. Now, obviously, it's helpful to have someone objective, right? Someone who's an expert to, you can say out loud like how things went, right? Details for each section, how you felt. And then, someone in that field will be able to, help you contextualize what were the pain points for you. They can also help contextualize whether the pain points can be easily addressable in the amount of time that's appropriate for your testing timeline versus, oh man, that's just more of like an internal characteristic of yours, right? So like, if you prefer pen and paper, the likelihood of you just really loving adaptive tests in the near future is slim to none, especially since Montgomery County students should be pretty familiar with adaptive tests because a lot of your state level tests are adaptive, right? So if you haven't gotten used to it by then, like if it still kind of gives you the heebie-jeebies, right? Like it probably, that's not going to change when it comes to these standardized tests. So these are all, so like having an expert to help you analyze potential pitfalls and the amount of time that you can make improvements could be really helpful. So this is how you can help, determine the best fit for which test you take. And I think I've gotten everything I needed to say on my end, specifically when it comes to SAT and ACT. So I'll now hand over the proverbial mic to Nancy, our program director at C2. So Nancy, you can take it from here whenever you're ready. I'm happy to move the slides along for you.
Okay, thank you, Millie. Yeah, I'm ready. Let's move to the next slide. Okay, yeah. So for our program, what we can do is that we are more like a comprehensive program that help with all the steps for your college application. Let's say we can help with like the class GPA and college planning, definitely including the SAT and ACT. So all the class planning journey is based on your preference. Okay, and then also for every student, the program is very personalized. For example, we will start with a diagnostic test to see where you are at the moment to identify the strengths and the weakness area. And based on that part, together we'll set up like a game plan together. And so every class is based on what we need to work on. All the teachers who work at C2 are the top 5% of the subject they teach. So what we teach is that all the high school subjects, the APs, IBs, and college essay, for sure SAT and ACT. The teacher is having like ongoing training to make sure the quality of